Hello and welcome to the Drum History Podcast. I am your host, Bart Vanderzee, and today we are joined by our very old friend, Mr. Paul Wells. Paul, welcome back.
I'm not that old.
Old buddies, right?
Yeah, we go way back. We go back. Well, we've done like 400 episodes. Four on Neil Peart and 3 and sort of an extra one on Tony Williams. That was we were busy a couple years ago.
We were busy, and then I think what would happen is, well, first off, I think you are one of the most returning guests, which is a great honor. Anytime you say, "Hey, let's do a gear episode," I know it's going to be unbelievably thorough. Before we jump into this, which we're talking about the legendary, iconic Mr. Steve Gadd. Paul has been on before. Well, first off, Paul is he's a teacher at Juilliard for jazz percussion, jazz drums.
Yeah,
jazz drums. Yep. And then Curtis Stigers, and then Vince Giordano.
Yeah.
And the Nighthawks.
That's right.
New York. He's a mover and a shaker in New York. So watch out for this guy. But we're honored to have him back on here. But what I was getting at is if you like this episode, be sure to check out the Neil Peart series. Be sure to check out the Tony Williams series. These are is as in-depth as you can possibly get. And today we're talking about the legendary Steve Gadd. If someone's watching this and somehow stumbled upon it and doesn't know who Steve Gadd is, why don't you give a little primer on who Mr. Gadd is?
Oh, well, Steve is one of the most recorded drummers of all time. He's on a staggering number of hit songs and hit records. His first sort of, I guess, breakthrough. I mean, he recorded a lot before this, but one of the first big hits that he played on was The Hustle by Van McCoy, which was one of the first disco hit songs. And that really helped put him on the map of, every producer wanted to have him after that. And he's on Paul Simon, 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, and Late in the Evening. He's on Carly Simon records, Ricky Lee Jones, Quincy Jones. I mean, it's unbelievable amount of stuff. And as the studio scene kind of started to die down in the 90s, he became kind of the A-list touring drummer for Paul Simon, Eric Clapton, and James Taylor. And he's still juggling those 3 gigs. He's actually, as we speak, I think playing in Boston right now with James Taylor.
Wow. Probably literally right now while we're talking.
Literally right now. I think they started at
8:50 p.m.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
Nice.
But Steve is also just amazingly influential. There are a number of playing and also equipment sort of innovations that he, either invented himself or popularized, and his, still his legacy. I mean, if you went to any drum shop right now and you just looked at you close your eyes and pointed at a random kit in a new, a drum shop, like a brand new kit, there's a good chance that the sizes of the toms are 10 and 12, a 10-inch rack tom, a 12-inch rack tom. And no one really did that. I mean, we'll get to this. There actually were a couple of people sort of doing it, but Gadd is the reason that became sort of first popular and then standardized as sort of like your standard, 2 rack tom setup. Steve Gadd absolutely was the one who popularized that. So he
is truly just a legend, and is just in this. There's this you fight the urge to say the Mount Rushmore of drummers, though, of like Vinny, Steve Gadd, and then there's just a whole host of others that are iconic where you cannot narrow them down. But those two, Dave Weckl, those 2 guys, there's something about them, the clinician. I guess Steve's not as much of a clinician, really.
I mean, he has done a fair amount of them, but I think often just doesn't have time for them.
Yeah, he's so a performer.
Busy. Yeah, he's busy. I mean, not that Vinny and Weckl aren't either, but he is so in demand with touring and recording obligations that he has done. He also one of the first, not the first, but one of the first very popular drum videos was, his Steve Gadd Up Close. That was, there were a couple others before him. There was a Lenny White video, and DCI had done a couple before Gadd, but Gadd was sort of the one that really put that company, but also really the sort of format of the drum instructional video on the map.
Was he playing like popular. An Ampex like tape box in that video?
The second one he did. Yeah, Steve Gadd in Session. There's a point where he demos some brushwork and he's playing on an Ampex tape box. Box,
which is super cool. It went on for I remember it going on for a very long time, and I was like, man, he's got this vibe to him that's just, he's not rushed. He's methodical. He's fine. He's just got this super chill vibe about everything he does.
He's very relaxed, very confident without being in any way egotistical.
No.
Just, he knows what he does and who he is. And he is also extremely, I've found him to be unbelievably kind and generous and patient. And concerned with, we'll get to this, but we did this interview, and at the end of the interview, he was like, did you get what you needed? Was that good? Did I answer all the questions? Do you have what you need for the interview? Which is
such a nice guy.
Yeah. I mean, it almost took me aback that he was like concerned that like I got what I needed from it. And it's like, of course.
Yeah. Well, let me set this up, and then, we'll get to what everyone wants, is jumping into the photos that Paul has, it's the Paul Wells style of episode where it's going to be a bunch of pictures that I will put up on the screen and superimpose. He's screen sharing with me right now, and I'm going to, edit them in later. But Paul, with the help of our dear friend and great friend of the show, Mr. John DeChristopher, from Live from My Drum Room, John DeChristopher helped kind of coordinate an interview with Steve that Paul did that is going to be either part 2 or part 3 of this series that we're going to release. And I will not be in it because it was Paul leading the interview, and I've watched it, and he did a phenomenal job. He learned from the best, if I may say so myself. No, I'm kidding. No, you did an amazing job.
Thank you.
But you talked with Steve about a whole bunch of things. There may be some, like, we talk about it in certain detail in this episode, and then you will talk about it in detail that no one else except Steve Gadd himself can provide in that episode. But so if Paul refers to anything about having a conversation with Steve, it's most likely from that conversation, right?
Yeah, there will be some things where we'll look at some photos and I will just say, well, this is a kit that he used, and I'll watch the interview and you'll get his full story about what this is. But then there will be other things that we didn't really talk about that I'll go into more detail about. And to be honest, I want to say up front too that I actually, was a little, I wouldn't say flustered. He's very calming and he makes everybody feel very comfortable when you talk to him. But I was a little wrapped up in the moment and forgot to ask him. I had notes, but I still forgot to ask him a couple of things. So I will try to cover some stuff that I didn't get to talk to him about. But I as you mentioned, John DeChristopher was the one who set this all up, and I am forever thankful to him. He is also an extremely kind and generous person. And
totally.
I had called him actually just to ask him some questions about his experiences with Steve. As some of you may know, John DeChristopher worked at Zildjian for a long time, I believe 1989 to maybe 2013, I think.
Yeah, something like that.
He was artist relations and, worked very closely with Steve as well as a ton of other legendary drummers. And he also sort of manages Steve. He helps Steve out with things like interview requests and some other sort of, business things. So, he was definitely, I mean, honestly, it just called him to ask about, some things like, what kind of, what does Steve travel with when he goes overseas? What does he bring a snare drum? Does he just bring that kind of stuff? And after a little while, John just said, well, I just got to get you talking to Steve. Let me just coordinate a call between you guys, which I was like, oh, I mean, that would be amazing, but Really?
Definitely.
And he said, "Oh yeah, it's totally cool." So he's wonderful. Thank you so much, Sean, for hooking that up. I also want to thank a gentleman named Artie Smith, who I spoke to, who had teched for Steve in the '80s. Artie is a New York-based sort of drum tech and sort of drum genius who I'd actually worked with before on a couple other projects recently. Very, very, very nice guy and very knowledgeable, and had a great memory for a number of things that just things he knew about Steve's drums that he was sending to and from sessions and gigs and stuff in the '80s. And also, there's a lot of great resources. I wanted to. This is a gentleman that I don't know, but there's a guy who has a YouTube channel who's a Dutch drummer. He's from Holland, named Ruben van Roon. And anybody who's a Steve Gadd fan should check out his channel. Ruben is a fantastic drummer himself and very Steve Gadd influenced. And he has done a whole series of videos analyzing Steve's playing and talking about, he'll do like a short video of 10 or 15 minutes on, the way Steve Gadd tunes a snare drum or the kind of stuff Steve Gadd plays on his cowbell. Just like little, short topics like that, but they're really, really good. And Ruben plays so well and he can really emulate a lot of Steve's.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So check him out. I learned a lot from his channel as well. He also posts a lot of cool, rare videos of Steve Gadd playing, which has been really fun. So, speaking of these resources too, I wanted to mention that a thing that really inspired me to want to do this series with you is this book that recently came out about Steve called A Life in Time. And this was written by my good friend Joe Bergamini, who I think Joe's been on your show, right?
Joe's been on here. He's written so many amazing books on I think he actually talked about his writing books with Stuart Copeland and writing the amazing, kind of feature books that he does, which obviously
there's a Neil Peart. There's a Neil Peart book. There's a Billy Cobham book that I think just came out, and I haven't read that yet. I'm really anxious to read that. But Joe's a great drummer and a great guy, and this book is fantastic. It's put out by Hudson Music, which is basically the continuation of DCI, who put out all of those great music videos, all the great drum videos back in the day. But this is a really cool book because it's a bio of Steve. As it has a lot of great sort of just biography and photos and things that I'd never seen before, but it also has extremely well done transcriptions.
Wow,
tons and tons of transcriptions, and it's kind of cool because it's like a coffee table book, but when you get it, you also get another sort of reproduction of the transcriptions in the spiral book that you can leave in your practice room.
Nice.
So
more practical than a.
Yes, exactly. This is not the easiest thing to put on a music stand to try to read.
No.
So they have the music reproduced as well. So this is a really, really great resource. I was really excited when that book came out.
For sure.
I think it came out about a year or two ago. And then also, speaking of music books, Steve wrote this. I'm sure everybody's heard of this book by this point. Gaddaments.
That was huge.
It's Steve worked on this project. He came up with all of these amazing hand technique exercises, all sort of rudimental based. He came up with these during the pandemic. He was anxious to play and wanted to keep his chops together, and he just came up with all these great sort of like modern variations of rudiments, a lot of like flam paradiddle variations and flam taps. It's really great, and it's really hard, actually. A lot of this stuff is really challenging. So I recommend both of those books highly.
Cool.
As well as checking out Ruben.
Yeah. I'll put links for everything in the description of that. So let's jump into it. I don't want to deal too much with biographical stuff because that's not really what we do in these episodes. But of course, we will start. The very first kit that I want to talk about is the kit that he started with, and actually the book A Life in Time has more information than I'll give you really about this kit, but. It was basically like a pieced together kit that he got. He talks about it in the book, and also he talks about it a bit in the interview that I believe he got the snare drum first.
maybe for Christmas, and then at his next birthday he got the bass drum, and then maybe a year later he got the cymbal, and it kind of evolved like that. But I love this picture of him as a kid playing his first drum set, and the only thing I can really identify is it looks like there's a Leedy badge, I think, on the rack tom there.
Yeah, and the tack bottom heads, and that snare off over to his right, which he talks about in that part 2 or 3 interview, and
exactly, it's very cool. And there's in sort of Dixieland tradition, there's a wood block and a cowbell mounted on the bass drum, which actually the cowbell is something that he continues to use. He always has a cowbell, so that's something that kind of interestingly dates back to his childhood.
But that's from the Mickey Mouse Club video, isn't it? Where he's like Cubby or whatever, his friend, like, come on over, and and then he tap dances in it as well.
He was a child prodigy, and he was, I'm not sure what the story is. I think it might be in the book in more detail, but he actually appeared on the Mickey Mouse show, right? The actual Walt Disney TV show, playing drums and tap dancing. He was a very accomplished tap dancer. Yeah. And then this photo is from, this was a Rochester band that he was playing with. Maybe he's sort of a guest soloist, but that's actually the Naumburg band shell in Central Park in New York City. I'm pretty sure. I've played that band shell a couple of times, and I'm pretty sure I recognize it.
Well, for our audio only people here, to explain that one a little bit, he's got kind of a interesting hat on, kind of a marching band style outfit, and is playing what appears like with
older musicians,
like adults in almost like military outfits.
I think, again, check out the book. I think there might be more info about this gig, but
no floor tom, which was common of the time.
So he talks about that throne that he's sitting on in the interview. I believe he made it, or somebody made it for him. Yeah. But that's all stuff to check out in the future episode. So the next kit that he gets around 1957, he talks. He says he got his uncle bought him a Gretsch set. And we see that here. Now, this is actually a photo from a little later, maybe in the early 60s, where I think he might be a teenager. But this kit is actually really cool. And
it is cool.
Steve says he still has this kit. It's a round badge Gretsch set, 9x13 rack tom, 16x16 floor tom, 14x22 bass drum. Now, he had a matching snare. I think there's another photo. No, this isn't it. There's another photo where you can see that he had a matching snare for it. But if I look closely, I think that's actually possibly a Rogers Dynasonic snare drum back there. Yeah. But what's cool about this kit is it's Midnight Blue Pearl, which was a really, really common and popular finish for Gretsch in the mid to late 50s. I had a kit actually very much like this for a while. But this appears to be a 3-ply kit because you have stick chopper hoops on both of the toms. You can see Gladstone, what they call the Gladstone style floor tom brackets.
Oh, sure.
2 little posts on the side.
Kind of very well engineered. For
Actually,
the time.
I like those floor tom brackets better than the diamond plates that they started using in the later 50s. And then
painted logo by his uncle, right?
Yeah,
if I remember correctly. I don't want to spoil. It's hard to not spoil things. I know. From the Steve Gadd part too. But
Steve explains a little more about that logo and who made it for him. But I believe these would be 3-ply Gretsch drums, possibly with clear interiors. Not the later 6-ply with die-cast hoops. This is an earlier kit. I asked him about those cymbals. He remembered them being Zildjian, but not much more beyond that. But yeah, this is a really great, cool kit that that he I guess that's kind of the kit that he got started with, and he talks about how that sort of led to the next kit. And there's a story that he's told and Chick Corea has told, and it's sort of been reproduced in a lot of other interviews. And I'll sum it up really quickly, but we talk about it in the interview. Basically, he was he was off playing a gig, and he got hired to play an extended run in Rochester with Chuck Mangione's band, and Chick Corea had come in from New York to play. I think Chuck and Chick were in Art Blakey's band together at the time, and they were playing a gig together in Rochester, and Steve was going to be the drummer. And this was like an extended, maybe it was for a month or something like that. And the way that the story is told is that Steve was playing great, but Steve was still kind of coming out of more of a bebop and swing style. He was very influenced by Buddy Rich, Gene Krupa, and also Art Blakey, Max Roach, Jimmy Cobb. But Chick and Chuck Mangione were into what Miles's group was doing in the mid-'60s with Tony Williams, which is sort of a more, I guess, so-called modern style of playing,
Sure.
a little freer, a little more over the bar line and unpredictable as far as drumming goes. And Steve wanted to kind of emulate that style, so he bought a new kit. He kept that Gretsch kit, but he bought this next kit, which is a black Rogers kit, a bebop kit, what we now call a bop kit, 8 by 12 inch rag tom, 14 by 14 floor tom, 14 by 18 inch bass drum. And this appears that it's in a black finish.
This week's episode is brought to you by Claw. How many times have you looked down mid-set and realized your bass drum slid forward 6 inches? It's frustrating, right? That's why there's Claw, the small but mighty kick drum anchor that keeps your bass drum exactly where it should be. Here's how it works. Claw's backward-facing spikes dig into your drum rug every time you kick, locking your drum solidly into place. No Velcro, no special rug, no hassle. It's tiny, about the size of a deck of cards, so it fits right in your gig bag or stick bag. Setup takes just seconds. You just slip it right in front of your bass drum, then grip it and rip it. It's made from durable, shock-proof ABS plastic. Claw can take a beating without budging, no matter how hard or fast you play. And thanks to its premium TPU top layer, it'll never leave a mark on your drum. Claw is simple, tough, and totally invisible once it's set up. But you'll know it's there every time you kick your drum and it stays perfectly locked in. Head to clawdrum.com, that's KLAW drum.com, where you can purchase it for only $29 on Amazon. And if you use promo code KLAW15OFF, that's CLAW15OFF, you get an additional 15% off when you're checking out on Amazon. Get the Claw and never chase your bass drum again.
Which is also kind of cool because this would be Steve's first black drum set, which is something that's sort of a signature of his later on. And this is the kit that he was playing when they were doing that gig. And he talks about getting that kit because he wanted to change his sound and get more of that sort of updated sound. And that Chick had actually played that kit. They were hanging out, and Chick could play drums really, really well.
Yeah, he was
could
good.
play a lot like Tony. And Chick kind of sat down and demonstrated some of Tony's language to Steve, and that like was the first time that for Steve, like seeing Chick do it, it really resonated with him, and it was the first time that he felt like he could really understand that way of playing. So,
sure.
but I asked him about that, and you know, he kind of tells a story of how he got that little Rogers kit.
Yeah, that was neat. Do we know cymbals at this point? I can't remember if you talked about it or
we
safe
talk
to
about
assume Zildjian probably.
I mean, he's always used Zildjian, and you know, he's like a very dedicated Zildjian player, and you know, may have used A's early on. He talks about Art Blakey having given him an old K at one point, and then he talks about also having gotten some old K's when he was in the Army. Which is actually the next kit that we see, which is the kit that he used in the Army. And this is a great photo of him in his uniform. He had joined the Army after college and was in the band, the jazz band. And this is actually one of the things that I forgot to ask him about, and I apologize. I don't know whether he owned this kit or whether this was a kit that was owned by the Army, because I know a lot of the time now, and I think back then too, the armed forces would own instruments. That, you know, because drummers would sort of come and go. So they would own a kit that all the different drummers would play. So this may have been an Army kit, because we don't see him with this kit. We only see him playing this kit when he's with the Army.
Sure. Standard issue military drum set.
Right. It's another Rogers kit, silver sparkle, and it looks to be 8x12, 14x14, and a 14x20 with a nice metal Dynasonic snare drum. Certainly a really great sounding kit.
And there's some video of him playing Sissy Strut something like that, which is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he was playing so incredibly well already at that point. He talks about getting the hi-hats that he used for much of his career, only kind of recently retired them. He talks about having gotten a couple of pairs of old K hi-hats. He was stationed, I don't know if he was stationed in Brooklyn. I mean, there was a Brooklyn Navy Yard, but there's also an Army base, Fort Hamilton Army base in Brooklyn. I don't know where he was, but he talks about being in Brooklyn when he was in the Army and going to the Gretsch factory, which, up until 1968 or 69 was still in Brooklyn. And he used to be able to go there and pick out old Ks, which I think we talked about this during the Tony Williams episode. That for anybody who doesn't know, K Zildjians, which were the Zildjians that were made in Istanbul, Turkey, and were hand-hammered and made there up until about 1978. They were distributed by Gretsch, the Gretsch Drum Company. So they would, made in Turkey, and they would ship them to the Gretsch factory in originally in Brooklyn, and drummers could go there and pick out cymbals. And Steve picked out a couple pairs of hi-hats, a light pair and a heavier pair. And he ended up kind of using the heavier pair for much of his career. And Artie confirmed this, and Gadd has talked about this elsewhere, that he liked to play the heavier cymbal on top. Most people now will use the heavier of the two cymbals. If their hi-hat pair will use the heavier cymbal on the bottom, but Steve liked to use the heavier cymbal on top because it gave him a little better articulation.
Wow, interesting. Even that would literally never occur to me.
Right. Oh, yeah. Me neither. I've tried it. Sometimes I have hi-hats that sound better that way, and it is interesting. Yeah, it gives it a different kind of feeling and sound to the stick, and it definitely can increase the bite of the hi-hat.
Sure.
So he gets out of the Army, and he gets this next kit. I believe around 1972, he gets another Gretsch set. And this set for a little while lived at the Zildjian headquarters. So these photos, these are a couple of photos that, are of the kit in the lobby of the Zildjian factory. And this is a stop sign era Gretsch. These would have been made in Arkansas at the time. The Gretsch factory had moved to Arkansas by this point. This looks like a walnut finish. It looks like maybe the bass drum is faded a little more, or it might just be the lighting here. 8x12 inch rack tom, 14x14 inch floor tom, 14x18 bass drum. You don't see it here, but he also had a matching snare, a 5.5x14 wood snare drum. And this had a rail mount. There are other photos of this. There is a Chuck Mangione record called Alive. It was a live record from 1972 or so, and there's a great photo of Steve on the back cover. I had this record. I think I got this when I was in about 8th grade or 9th grade. Actually, I think it was 8th grade. I think it was still in middle school. I was just starting to get into Steve Gadd, and I heard about this record. And I'd seen a lot of pictures of Steve playing his Yamaha drums, and then to see this early photo of him without a beard, playing a Gretsch kit, it kind of blew my mind,
Yeah, because you think of him as Yamaha. He's synonymous, which we will get to Yamaha, and then stick with Yamaha. It's cool to see him play other stuff.
Well, he was still really kind of a bebop drummer at this point, bebop and post-bop. He was into Tony Williams, Elvin, Jimmy Cobb, Max Roach. Those are the guys. He still talks about these guys all the time. But when you listen to him on these early records, his feel is a little bit more I guess, I mean, it depends on what he's doing, because still to this day, if he's doing a jazzier thing, he'll get more on top of the beat and play with a little more of that sort of jazz bebop urgency, as opposed to the sort of laid back thing that you think of him doing when he's playing more sort of R&B and pop music. So it's really kind of, I guess he was doing more gigs at this time that were jazz gigs. It wasn't until a little bit later that he was getting interested in doing more sort of the pop and rock and R&B and funk of the 70s. That came a little bit later. Yeah. So at this point, you know, he had maybe just moved to New York. Again, the book has a lot more, you know, bio as far as, you know, exactly when he made that move and why and how he made that move and how he got involved with doing sessions. But he did this pretty extensive tour with Chuck Mangione, where they did a European tour, the same band that did Alive, with Tony Levin on bass and Jerry Nywood on saxophones. And there's video that just recently surfaced of this band at the Montreux Jazz Festival in Switzerland in 1972. And I bring this up specifically because we talked about this in the Tony Williams episode, because Chuck Mangione's quartet did a double bill with Stan Getz's quartet at the Montreux Jazz Festival. And Tony Williams was playing in Stan Getz's band along with Chick Corea and Stanley Clarke. And Tony apparently hadn't brought his own drums, was using backline drums. And Steve lent Tony his drums to use. So if you see, there's video of Tony as well playing with Stan Getz in 1972. And we saw a bunch of stills from that when we did the Tony Williams episode. Yep. Actually, probably could dig those up if you give me a second.
Yeah, or I can find it and superimpose it.
Yeah. There are a bunch of stills from that. He has different cymbals. Oddly, actually, was using Paiste 2002s at that festival. But that's a whole nother story. But the drums were actually Steve Gadd's drums. It's this kit, this walnut finished Gretsch kit that was Steve's kit for a few years. And you also see in this video some good shots of the cymbals that he was using at the time. And this photo here, 1972 Montreux Gretsch 4, that ride cymbal, if I'm looking at that with my eye for, and we talked about this with the Tony Williams episode, I'm a big fan and kind of a collector of old Ks, which we talked about a minute ago. That looks to me, if I just glance at that looks like what we refer to as an old stamp, old K, which means it dates from roughly the late 40s up until the late 50s. At some point, maybe between 48 and 57 or 58. It looks like the type of bill they were using in those days. A large bell, relatively flat bell. There's a sort of somewhat light lathing on the bow of the cymbal. I also see what looks like rivet holes, although I don't think he has rivets in this cymbal. But this is a really great looking cymbal.
Yeah. And that would be a early K, but that would be one that was still made in Turkey.
Yes.
Sent over, distributed
by
through Gretsch.
Yeah.
Which that whole time, I think I've wrapped my head around it more from doing the show for 6.5 years, but early on I was like, wait, the distribution, but there's an American, but there's the American, the Zildjian family who moved
simultaneously making cymbals in Boston.
Yes, and Quincy or whatever. Yeah,
Quincy. Yeah, and A's from the beginning were, you know, they started making them. I think 1929 is when they opened the Quincy factory. Yeah, the American Zildjian factory. It's either 27 or 29. I should know this.
I think because Carope fled, they had to flee, and there was. Check out the episode on it. There's a great episode on it.
There is. That is
with Paul
a great
Francis,
episode,
which is amazing.
Yeah.
But
totally. Paul knows all that history really well, and he explains it all really well.
Yes.
This. I mean, I don't know why Steve would have ended up. I mean, this is a 1972 Gretsch kit. Why he's playing potentially a 1950s era ride cymbal. He may have just found it used in a store somewhere. You know, he has talked about in interviews having found a nice 22 at Frank Ippolito's drum shop in New York City at some point, and maybe this was that cymbal. He's had different rides and different crashes. He's kept mostly the same hi-hats, but he's an interesting guy because, and this is a good time to bring this up, I don't get the impression that he babies his gear at all, and that he sees cymbals as, he loves cymbals, and he's really deep into cymbals and finding cymbals that he really loves and gives him the sound and response that he wants. But at the same time, he is not afraid to play them and to really hit them when the music is calling for it. He's not afraid. He's not going to he's not going to walk on eggshells around his gear. If
it breaks, it breaks, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. And, like a lot of people saw gear, the kind of gear that we think of as this priceless artifact of a bygone era. A lot of the musicians at the time saw it the same way we would see sticks and heads, like just disposable, basically. Like you use them until they break and then you get some new ones. Yeah. And
where this cymbal now, though, would be worth
this is easily a $3,000 cymbal at least. Yeah. An old stamp, that era, old K is, a 22. I'm pretty sure this is a 22. That's easily a $3,000 cymbal on the current, cymbal-holic market. Now, on the left there's some other shots where you can see it. On the left, it actually looks to me like an old A. Maybe a 20 or 19 or something like that. That actually looks, it's a little hard to see in these photos, but the lathing and the finish and the bell shape look to me like, an A from the 50s or possibly 60s.
Yep. This is a neat angle, though, with the stick bag. Yeah. And he's kind of got the buddy Rich hunched kind of stance at this point with his posture in this picture, which
he does. Yeah. He has an interesting technique of his left hand. He's plays a little more match grip these days, but when he plays traditional, he has sort of a way of digging in to the backbeat, the left hand backbeat, where he does kind of tilt. He hunches a little bit and tilts. And normally, like if I had a student who had this sort of posture, I might try to tell them, you're going to have some back problems. But Steve just turned 80.
Steve Gadd does it, Mr. Wells.
I know exactly.
That student would say.
Steve Gadd just turned 80, and he doesn't seem to be having any issues. So
yeah. I
mean, it certainly works for him.
Sure.
I think it's a feel thing. He until he got his Yamaha double pedal in the mid '90s, he was a diehard Gretsch floating action or Camco. This is another little history thing. I think you did an episode on this too, didn't you? About the
history of the 5000.
Yeah, the Gretsch floating action and the Camco. Camco made a pedal. It was the same pedal. It just said Camco on it as opposed to Gretsch. And I know Steve had a Gretsch floating action and a Camco that he used interchangeably all through the 70s and 80s and into the beginning of the 90s too. That was his go-to pedal. I'm pretty sure that's what he has on this kit because it looks the little bit of it that you can see. I have a couple of floating action pedals and they look exactly like that. It's kind of
with that post
thin,
and then and it looks and that has that Camco look, which then evolved into the 5000.
Yes, the DW 5000, which is still made, and I have a couple of those too. They're all great pedals. I really like them. The next kit that we see after this, now this is where things get a little confusing because there is this famous kit, which I'm going to go into depth with, which we see here. This is this famous white finished kit with pearl toms and a Gretsch 20-inch bass drum, and the Ludwig Superphonic. But before we look at that, I want to show you this photo of Steve playing, I believe, in 1973. So Steve talks about having gotten a Gretsch kit, another Gretsch kit after this walnut finish kit that had a few more toms. And he talks about, it's in the book, and I believe it's in the interview I did with him too. He talks about a kit that had a 12 and a 13 rack toms, 14 and 16 floor toms, and a 20-inch bass drum. This was a Gretsch kit. And I assumed that this photo here showed him playing that exact kit, which, as we can see, there's no bottom heads on the toms or on the bass drum. So I showed him this photo, and he said, no, I don't think that was my kit. I think that's a backline kit.
Yeah, because that's concert toms.
Those are concert toms, yeah. Now, what's interesting, just jumping ahead very briefly, if we look at this kit, this photo of him playing with Stuff, the band Stuff, and we look at this kit, and we zoom in on the bass drum. So this is the Gretsch bass drum that, to me, I'm pretty sure is the same bass drum that we see here. And the thing that gives it away, there's a few things that give it away. First of all, this is a very pixelated photo. It appears to be the same type of tom mount, which is Rogers' Dynasonic. And then also there's this sort of weird black mark on the sort of side, the upper side of the bass drum at about 10 o'clock.
Maybe right a sticker or something? Or?
Well, I never knew what that was. And you see what on the 20-inch bass drum here, the Gretsch bass drum with the white kit, you can see this weird black oval in the exact same spot. So that's what makes me think that this must be the same bass drum.
Sure.
So two things here to notice. The first one is that this bass drum this was a double-headed bass drum originally.
And the lugs are removed.
You can see two holes that have been filled in where the front lug was. Yeah. Directly opposite the batter lugs. So I think that Gretsch sold kits. If you look at the Gretsch catalog I think there's a 1973 catalog. And if you look at that catalog, there are actually kits that have single-headed toms but a double-headed bass drum. So it's possible that the toms had no bottom heads and the bass drum did. Or it's also possible that this kit, all of the drums had bottom heads, and he took not only the heads but the lugs off of them, which was common in the 70s when you were doing recording dates, because people were really starting to get anal about there not being extraneous noise coming from the drums. So people would talk about doing things like packing their lugs with cotton balls so that the springs inside didn't make any noise, and just cleaning up any sort of potential rattles and extra noise that was coming from the drums. And if you were going to use single-headed drums and modify your double-headed drums, the best way to do that in those days, some people would have felt would be to actually take the bottom lugs off that weren't being used, because then there wasn't the potential for for any rattles. Yeah, basically. So it's possible that he did that here with this kit, but I don't know. He swore that this was not his kit, so I want to believe him on that. But the story is, and he goes into some detail, he didn't like the way the toms sounded. And I think that they were just a little too Gretchy and a little too jazzy. And he was starting to do more sessions. He was starting to get more into playing R&B and playing funk. And he was getting really influenced by drummers like Rick Marotta. I've always mispronounced his name. Rick Marotta. Particularly Chris Parker. There are a number of drummers that he talks about being influenced by. Bernard Purdy, guys that were doing a lot of those sort of pop and rock and funk sessions in those days. And he really wanted to learn how to do that and learn how to play that sort of laid back, sort of funky style. And part of that was the sound, like learning how to get that, what at the time was a very current sound, which was a deader, warmer, punchy sort of sound. Yeah. And he felt like he was getting that from the bass drum, but he wasn't getting that from the toms. And he said that he traded the toms. I think he said he took them back to Frank Ippolito's, the 12, 13, 14, and 16, and traded them for a set of pearl fiberglass concert toms. And he had a full set of these. 6, 8, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. Full set of 8 concert toms, which normally would have been, those were originally designed for classical percussionists to use for certain modern classical repertoire would. I mean, you sometimes hear it actually in like soundtracks and stuff. You hear this sort of concert tom sound coming from the percussion section. And he says that he had bottom heads put on all of the drums, all 8 of them. And he started experimenting with different setups, trying all of the different drums, and landed on this setup of a 10-inch rack tom, a 12-inch rack tom, and then a 13-inch floor tom, and not really a floor tom, but a 13 and a 14 mounted as toms, not really, but in the floor tom position, but mounted. This became a really standard thing in the 80s and 90s, that again, Steve Gadd was really the first one to do this.
I've used those wood fiberglass pearl sets before at a studio, and I remember the little toms. Mm-hmm. The other ones had bottom heads, but I remember the little toms, the 6 and the 8, because I'm sure that was a common. It was like out of a magazine, or a catalog order. But I remember those being concert toms with nothing on the bottom. I wonder if he obviously probably modified it and they put lugs on it and put the bottom heads on it for him.
I was curious whether or not he only had the 10, 12, 13, 14, since that's the only thing you really see him playing. If those are the only ones he had.
Right. They had a weird stand that was like this odd kind of like very impractical stand.
That's the type of stand that these came on. And you can actually see in a photo. So the 13 and 14 were actually had clip mounts and still use this. This is like the typical stand that you find concert toms on. Neil Peart's concert toms in the 70s and 80s had this exact same type of mounting called clip mounts. And you had you could adjust
no movement.
No, right. You could adjust the height and you could adjust the angle towards you or away from you, but you couldn't angle each drum independently of each other.
No.
So they both went that way and up, or this way and down, so kind of limited, but that was pretty standard at the time. But he had the 10 and the 12 modified to take Rogers Dynasonic.
The Swivomatic.
Swivomatic, thank you. Yeah, not Dynasonic.
With the slight egg shape of the ball, the knuckle, which is kind of a cool Rogers.
And that brings us back to this bass drum, because when Steve saw this, he said, "Oh, you see that bracket on there? That was I had originally had a Rogers cymbal mount on the bass drum." And that's, of course, that's exactly what it is. And he took the mount off, but he left the plate. He left the metal plate there. So that's actually what that is. You see the screw
holes kind of, and where it would be, or the screws, not the holes, the screws. Very cool.
Yeah, that's exactly what that is. And you can see here, you can see the Rogers stuff. It was 2 separate single tom arms that he had. He didn't have like a proper double tom holder. You can see that there's like one mount, like a single tom arm for the 12 and another single tom arm sort of behind it for the 10. Yeah. Now, speaking of the 10, and this is where things get a little interesting. There are interviews with Rick Marotta where he says that and Steve also talks about how he and Rick were really good friends, and that they were talking about drums all the time and coming up with ideas and talking about what kinds of heads worked best for a certain type of sound and what sizes worked. And Rick has taken credit for saying, I was the first one to use those sizes. I was the first one to get bottom heads put on Pearl concert toms. And he apparently was, because this is a photo of Rick in the 70s. I don't know exactly when, but this is him, believe it or not, playing a Pearl 8-inch and 10-inch concert toms that have been modified to have bottom heads put on them. Now, what's really weird about this is that in order to do that, because of the holes that are left and not really being able to fit a normal sort of lug or 2 lugs, he's actually used Slingerland snare drum lugs. That's what these lugs are.
Single in the middle, top and bottom. Yes. That's genius.
This is Slingerland. And Steve's Pearl kit also had Slingerland lugs, Slingerland snare drum lugs in the middle. Now, I don't know what type of holes would have been left over that, like, I don't know why he would have, used this and not used, because Pearl made a snare drum lug that would have fit. And there are some people that have made kits. Actually, Ruben Van Roon, who I mentioned earlier, has some Pearl concert toms that he had modified to have bottom heads, fiberglass, just like Steve Gadd's.
Yep.
And he used Pearl snare drum sort of center lugs. But for whatever reason, both Steve and Rick Marotta used Slingerland lugs in the middle for
Amazing.
to modify the toms.
Yeah.
So, excuse me.
Very cool.
I don't know what kind of holes they might have left by taking the Pearl lugs off.
Probably didn't. They didn't care.
They didn't care. Yeah, they didn't care about this kind of stuff. We also see, this is the first use we see of him using his trusty Ludwig Superphonic snare, the 400, as that's the model number. A lot of people just refer to them as the 400. It's 5x14. I mean, everybody knows what a Superphonic is, right? Come on.
Yep.
5x14, aluminum shell, chrome plated, 10 lugs. Amazing snare drum. Always sounds great, always records great. That was Steve's go-to until the mid-90s. And this is really, he had this time, he lived in this house in the early 70s, and he had a drum room in the basement. And he had apparently a bunch of different kits set up, and he was really getting into experimenting with different sizes and different heads and tuning, and really that's where he sort of developed the Steve Gadd sound that really became incredibly popular, incredibly influential, and is still kind of with him. I mean, his sound's changed a bit over the years, but it's still kind of, he still uses similar sizes. He's still a 2-up, 2-down guy, still tends to use a 10 and a 12, and relatively small floor toms. Sure. He really like sort of crafted this sound very deliberately. And, with some influence from Rick Marotta, maybe some influence from Chris Parker, and, maybe talking to recording engineers and, producers, the kind of, asking them the kind of things that they wanted to hear.
He's definitely not, as you said before, I'll just throw in, he's absolutely not afraid to experiment, and knows that his domain, his drums really do affect the sound of an album. And and the sound, like it helps shape the sound of the whole thing. Totally. I wonder if he got involved with miking as well, and drum microphones and
I've
technology.
Never heard him talk about that. I think usually I feel like I've heard him say this. I can't point to any interviews where he says this, but I think that he's kind of I trust them to get my sound. I know he gets hands-on with his live sound, and he's very specific about what he wants from his monitor mix when he's playing live. But I think as far as in the studio with miking and reproduction, he lets the engineers do their job and do their thing. I don't think he has any really specific demands. But again, that's something I should have asked him. So these sizes that he settled on was basically a shallow 10-inch tom is probably, I know actually it's a 6.5 by 10, because that was sort of the standard concert tom size that Pearl made, and Slingerland and everybody who made concert toms, Ludwig. The 6 and the 8 were 5.5 inches deep. The 10 is 6.5, and then you get to more standard sizes, 8 by 12. And then Steve's floor toms were 9 by 13, 10 by 14. The Gretsch bass drum is a 14 by 20. And I think that's really amazing and interesting to think that all of these great records he made until the late 70s are on a 20-inch bass drum. And if you listen to these records, man, I mean, if you listen to like Chick Corea's Leprechaun, I should point out some records where you can definitely hear this kit. The Leprechaun by Chick Corea is sort of the most famous record that, they recorded that at Electric Lady, and Steve has great recollections of that session, and he definitely used this kit at that session. There are some other Chick Corea records. The Mad Hatter and Friends were both recorded. These are two of my favorite records. well, Leprechaun too. The Mad Hatter and Friends, I actually found out, were recorded at the same recording sessions in 1977. And Mad Hatter came out that year, but Friends came out the year after, in 1978. But they were actually both recorded. I had asked Chick's longtime recording engineer, a gentleman named Bernie Kirsch, who was Chick's studio and live sound engineer for almost his, from the mid 70s on. He recorded every record and mixed every gig, which is amazing.
Yeah, very cool.
So Bernie told me that they had allotted about 4 days to do the rhythm tracks for Mad Hatter. It was very complicated music, but they were all so great that they finished it all very quickly and had all this leftover time in the studio. So Chick said, hey, I've got some more tunes. Let's make another record. So they basically then just blew out in a day or two the entire Friends record.
Jeez.
Yeah. So
astonishing. Yeah.
And there are photos. If you get the LP for Friends, there's some photos in the studio of the session on the back cover, and you can see a photo where you can see this exact kit. So we know, even though it was recorded in LA, we know that Steve was using this kit on both of those recordings. There's also a video of him besides this still, which is from I think he's playing with Paul Simon here on SNL maybe.
Well, it's interesting he's using like a quote-unquote Franken kit, mix of Pearl and Gretsch live. So he's clearly not like an endorsed Gretsch artist where they care. So was he ever, or
no? His first endorsement would have been Yamaha.
Oh wow, okay.
And it was actually around this time period that he first got hooked up with Yamaha. Yamaha started making drums in the late 60s. Maybe I think 67 is the first Yamaha catalog. And their first artist was Al Foster, who just recently passed away, who was an amazing jazz drummer, one of my favorites. He when he did his first Japanese tour with Miles Davis, I believe in 1972, Yamaha sort of sponsored the whole tour and gave all of the guys in the band Yamaha gear to play and to endorse, including Al. And Al was really the only one who really took to the instruments and continued using Yamaha the whole entire rest of his life until he passed away.
It's amazing gear.
Yeah, it is. It is. I'm a Yamaha artist. I love their stuff. It's incredible. But I think Steve went to Japan. I don't know if it was first time, but I believe he went with the band's stuff. I might have been with somebody else. I'm not sure, but he went at some point around 75 or 76, and I guess the people at Yamaha who were making drums had signed him at that point, because he is sort of on record as being an artist since 1976 for them. But you don't really see him using the drums until the late 70s. That's when you start seeing photos of him playing Yamaha. There's still photos and footage of him around 77 and maybe even into 78 playing this white kit. We talked a bit about the cymbals when we were talking about the kit from 72, but I actually thought that I'd talk a bit about the cymbals after we went through all the drums.
Yeah, go for it.
Which we did with Tony. We did the drums first, and then we did an episode just on the cymbals and sticks and heads and stuff like that. But I should point out that with this Gretsch kit, the early the 1972 Gretsch kit, we see, of course, just coated ambassadors, or they might have been Gretsch permatones, but just your sort of standard single ply white coated head that a jazz guy would have used at the time.
Well used, worn in.
Yeah, right. He started experimenting with heads around the time that he got into this, the white kit with the Pearl and Gretsch hybrid kit. And most people know him as using Evans hydraulic heads in this era with this kit. And there's actually a photo of him in the studio in 1976 where you see him using Evans hydraulic heads on this kit. What's very interesting, though, is that snare drum is not his regular superphonic. That's apparently, and I don't know much about this drum at all, but apparently that's what's called a Hinger touch tone snare. Have you ever heard of this brand?
No.
Hinger. I believe it was a snare that was kind of designed for classical
Okay.
artists. I'm not sure. People who know about the snare, feel free to comment. Let us know more about the snare. But that apparently is what that snare is. You see his old K hi-hats. You see some really sort of basic, I think they're Gretsch, very, very lightweight cymbal stands here, which is kind of cool. But you can see the Evans heads on the toms. Now,
Yeah, clear.
Well, so he used hydraulics.
Oh, which are like
He is always, the oil, 2 plies
the oil,
with oil,
yes,
with oil in between, which deaden them even further.
Very fun to poke.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you can see the oil. It looks kind of like a trippy space, like a galaxy kind of.
Yeah.
So those heads give you this really great, really dry and punchy, but also really warm and deep drum sound. It's really amazing for toms, and he used those heads on the bass drum too. There's an interview with him in Downbeat magazine in 1976, and this is worth, if you can find a copy of this, it's really worth reading. But he talks about his drum setup at the time. So this is December 2nd, 1976 is the issue. So this interview was probably done maybe a month or two before. And he talks about this exact kit. My personal set is a Gretsch bass drum with Pearl tom-toms. He talks about the sizes. And he also he doesn't talk about his heads at this point, but he talks about, well, I'll get to the cymbals. He does talk about his cymbals in this. 2 years later, he's interviewed in Modern Drummer. This is the October 1978 issue of Modern Drummer. And some really great photos of a very 70s Steve Gadd. And in this one,
cool
he
you have
talks,
that.
Yeah. This is it's actually, I got it on eBay. It's a really good condition copy of this. He talks about his sticks. He talks about the heads and the drums he's using. Where does he say I use Evans hydraulic heads on the bass drum and on the tops of all my toms. I like the clear Remo Ambassador heads on the bottom. My snare drum has an Ambassador coated on the batter side and a clear Diplomat on the snare side. So Steve, I'm glad I thought of this too. That reminded me. Steve is an adamant user of a clear Diplomat bottom snare head. And he talks about it at length in the interview that I did with him. So check out the interview when that comes out. He'll explain exactly what it is that he likes about that. But apparently that goes back at least until 1978 that he was into that very, very, very thin bottom head. Now, here's something about the hydraulics, though, that I wanted to discuss. So this goes back to a Steve Jordan interview. Now, if you listen to a couple of the records that I mentioned, and one I didn't actually, there's a Stanley Clarke record called Journey to Love, which is a really awesome record that you should check out because Steve sounds amazing. Everybody sounds amazing on it. And his hookup with Stanley Clarke is phenomenal. Steve is clearly playing this kit. You can hear the 10-inch tom clear as day. It's like, it's definitely this kit. And it's from that era. I think it's 75 or so. If you listen to that record and also Leprechaun, the tom sound is a little thinner and a little more open than it would be by 1977 if you listen to the Chick Corea, Mad Hatter, and Friends records, where I think I'm pretty sure he's using the hydraulic heads on the later records. So there's a Steve Jordan interview in Modern Drummer in 1985, around the time that Steve is doing the Letterman show. Steve was the original drummer in the David Letterman, The World's Most Dangerous Band. So this is the June 1985 Modern Drummer. This is an interview with Steve Jordan. I also learned a lot about tuning from Steve Gadd, which is bizarre because Steve Gadd's sound is completely different now than it was when I met him. I kind of inherited that tom sound that I loved about him originally. It was a live sound, but not that ringy Billy Cobham thing. Steve had just the right touch with his old set of Pearl drums. I'll never forget those drums because I played a gig on them. Those drums just sang. I couldn't believe how good I sounded, and I had played like I'd never played before. I've been tuning my drums the same way ever since, but he's changed. He's gone to the heavier thing, first with hydraulics and then with pinstripes. I've been through all of that, as well as the Canasonics. Canasonic was a drum head company that was around briefly in the 80s that made really thick heads again. So that's what he's referring to. I've been through all of that as well as the Canasonics, but that stuff just doesn't work for me. I stay with the clear ambassadors. So what that says to me, and I wish I could just call up Steve Jordan and ask him, but what that says to me is that Steve originally had Remo Clear ambassadors potentially on his Pearl kit, and then a year or two later moved to this sound with the hydraulics. That's what I think Steve Jordan is referring to. And if you listen to the Leprechaun, listen to the drum sound on the Leprechaun and the drum sound on Stanley Clarke Journey to Love. Especially there's a tom-tom fill that opens the first tune, which is called Silly Putty. Listen to that tom sound on those two records and compare it with the tom sound on Chick Corea Mad Hatter and Chick Corea Friends, which is much deeper and darker and drier. And it
which
sounds
would be the
like
hydraulics later sound.
To me, it sounds like the difference between a kit with clear ambassadors and a kit with Evans hydraulics on the top.
Yeah,
I'm not saying this is not definitive, but I have a theory that I think, based on what Steve Jordan's talking about and also what I hear on those records, that I think Steve Gadd initially was using a much thinner, more open head on those toms.
Yeah, I like that he's willing to experiment, and hydraulics are cool. My first drum teacher used a Butcher Block Rogers kit with blue hydraulics on it. Awesome. And it was just like, and I'm in the basement of this house, and it was just like, it just has this cool, very like,
it sounds like a record.
It sounds like a record.
Yeah.
It sounds like it's EQ'd.
It sounds like a certain type of record. It sounds like an Eagles record or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It smelled like an Eagles record in there.
Oh, that sounds like heaven. So we should point out too that Evans made these hydraulic heads, and also they had a head called Rock, the Rock head, which was just the 2-ply head without the oil. And actually, going back to Neil Peart, Neil used Rock heads on the tops of his rosewood finished Tama kit and also his Slingerland kits. He used the Rock chrome on the top. And then his bottom heads, believe it or not, were Evans blue hydraulic. So the hydraulic and the Rock heads were available in all these different finishes. You could get clear, black, blue, and red.
Yeah.
And I know you could also get chrome, and I think they made gold as well. And I think I recall vaguely that in those days there were people that swore there was a sound difference between the blue ones and the red ones and the black ones and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
Who knows? I remember people swearing that. Remember the Peisty color sounds?
Yes.
I remember people swearing that the different color of the color sounds sounded different. The red ones sounded different than the blue ones. I don't know. Maybe. So,
yeah.
Anyway,
comment if you think that sounds.
Yeah. Please don't troll us. That's the evolution basically of that kit. Again, like, check out those records. But as we get later into the 70s, we start to see Steve initially in Japan only. We see him. Oh, you know what? Before we get to the Yamaha stuff, there are some photos that I wanted to show you that are, you see sometimes where he's using studio kits. And he talks about this again, like a lot of the time when he was doing sessions, and this is actually great. You'll notice in the interview, and I've heard other people sort of his generation, when they talk about doing recording sessions, they refer to them as dates. It's like, oh yeah, I was doing a lot of dates back then.
Hal Blaine or something.
Exactly. That was sort of like, I think maybe New York lingo for a recording session. Kind of like how different people who play in wedding bands, there are different names for, like, some people refer to them as weddings. Some people refer to them as casuals. Some people refer to them as GB. You ever heard that? General business?
I have
It's
not.
like, oh yeah, I've got a GB on from 7 to 11 on Saturday. General
No, I've only heard people refer to GB as a gravity bong in high school, and those.
Maybe that's what they were talking about.
A GB after the GB.
No, yeah, definitely, or before, depending on your needs. Yeah, that was it's they're sort of regional colloquialisms.
Yes.
So maybe dates is that too. Maybe dates is a regional thing where people in LA called them something different. But Steve refers to them as dates. So he's doing a lot of dates. And he talks about, doing 2 or 3 in a day sometimes. And he would bring or have his trap case brought to the session. And he talks about all this. It's great. So he would show up, his trap case just had his snare, his cymbals, and his pedal and his sticks. And he would show up with just that and use the studio drums. So here's a photo of him around 1978. This was in that same Modern Drummer article, actually. He's in Power Station. I've actually recorded in that room. That's
cool.
one of the small booths in, I believe, in Studio A in Power Station. Or I know, you know what, I'm lying. I think it's Studio C. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Looks like a Slingerland kit. You can see the bottom heads have been, the bottom lugs have been taken off. They've got hydraulics. Or some sort of Evans heads, but you can see Steve's cymbals, which we'll talk about later, and that looks like it's a Superphonic. It's probably Steve's. So that's him showing up and just playing, studio drums. Here's another shot of him playing some, looks like Slingerlands. Looks like pretty big tom-toms. They're Slingerlands, but they have pearl tom mounts, oddly. And again, he's got his own cymbals. He's got his sticks, and that's probably his Superphonic. So this was pretty common for him.
We're not going to talk about cymbals, but it looks like a stack.
Yeah, that was the thing he used a lot in the late 70s, is this, is basically a couple broken cymbals that he stacked up.
Sure.
So moving on to the Yamaha stuff, I think that the earliest... There's an album by Stuff, the band Stuff, that he was a member of. The album is called Live Stuff, and it was recorded on November 20th, 1978. And you can see the album cover. He's playing a Yamaha kit in the live photo. So at least in 78, he's using Yamaha in Japan, at least by late 78. And there's some promo photos of him that were done around that time. And what's really interesting is he's playing black recording customs. Although, if we're going to talk about the history of recording customs, they weren't initially called recording customs. That was sort of a name that started to be attributed to them by the early 80s. At this point, they were usually just referred to as the 9000 series, which was their sort of high-end series. But he's playing more drums, more toms than normal, and slightly different sizes than you would normally see him use shortly after. So he's actually got an 8, a 10, and a 12 rack toms, 3 rack toms. The 8 is a 6.5 by 8, and you can tell because it's got this strange lug, which is actually a snare drum type lug. That's the same lug that you would see on a 6.5 or a 7 by 14 snare drum that they used on their shallower small toms. And then an 8 by 10, an 8 by 12, and then on the floor he's got mounted a 9 by 13 and a 10 by 15. It's possible that that's a 20-inch bass drum, and the reason I think it might be is because of the distance between the bottom of the 12 and the top of the bass drum. There's a little bit more space there than you would see when he's definitely using a 22. So I think initially with the Yamaha stuff, he was trying to, or they were trying to kind of replicate the setup that he was using with the Pearl toms, which was, again, 10, 12, 13, and 14. And you see his setup in a lot of catalogs, a lot of Yamaha catalogs early on, they reference his setup as being that 10, 12, 13, 14. But he very quickly didn't use those sizes on the floor and would actually use bigger floor toms. Or
I was going to say, those seem very just kind of
small.
I guess shallow and small, and even just seeing the stick bag hanging off of it like that just looks a little.
It's odd.
It's odd. It's just different. Of course, he is a master and knows, but for a photo shoot, it's just like, that's an interesting.
Yeah, well, this is, other than the 8-inch, the third rack tom, these are exactly the same sizes as the Pearl kit, except for the 10 also. His Pearl 10 was 6.5 by 10. And this is an 8 by 10 in this kit in the photo. So he's photographed with that kit, doing those promo photos. He does this gig, the tour with Stuff in late 78, where he's apparently using those drums. 1979, he's in Japan with the band Steps. They record a live album at the Pit Inn. This is also a must listen. He is playing Yamaha recording customs on this. You can't really see the floor toms, but this is clearly a black, Yamaha at the time 9000 series.
Looks like just two toms on this one, but the third maybe.
The third, okay. So let me go back to that actually. There's interesting stuff about this the extra tom, or as we find out, toms, because I recently found somebody posted this on there's a Steve Gadd Facebook page, just a fan page called In Search of Steve Gadd, and it's like typical. There's a lot of stuff that's like, oh, it's the same photo you've seen 1,000 times. But sometimes people have posted some really interesting photos that I'd never seen before. And here's a photo from a Japanese tour, possibly the same one that he did with Stuff, where and this is definitely Steve's kit, because there are very recognizable cymbals here that we'll talk about later, particularly this ride, which you see has this very distinctive piece cut out of it. But what we have here is a recording custom kit with an 8, same kit I think that was in that promo photo, an 8-inch tom, a 10-inch tom, and a 12-inch tom, and then we have a 13 and a 14, and another floor tom, probably a 15, on a stand up above the 14.
Almost in like a gong bass drum type position.
Yes, very, very weird. You see a Yamaha wood snare drum, and you see his trademark Gretsch floating action bass drum pedal. And you see all of the toms have Evans hydraulic heads, or some sort of Evans heads. I assume they're hydraulic. Except for some reason the 8, if you look really closely, that's actually a Ludwig Rocker silver dot head. Because you can see that sort of offset Ludwig logo. What's that shape? It's like a sideways rectangle.
I bet my 6-year-old would know better than me, because that's like something you learn in school at that age.
And you can see the dot. You can see the dot on the head too. So that's very odd. That must have just they I guess didn't have an 8-inch Evans hydraulic head for him.
Yeah.
But this is a kit that was just, you can see the cowbell there too. This is just something that he used probably on a few gigs, and I guess he was just trying different things out. And I think that his relationship with Yamaha was at this time, and still is, very experimental, where they're always giving him new things to try. And he talks about this actually in the interview, about what he was looking for and what kind of things he told them that he wanted and what he wanted them to do differently. And that there were a number of things that he recommended to them. One of which actually was very interesting. If you look at some of the earliest Yamaha kits, even in the mid-70s, you look at catalogs, you sometimes see internal mufflers on some of the drums. And Steve talks about this in some of these early interviews. He talks about it for sure in this MD interview, about how much he really believed that all muffling should be done externally, as opposed to, internal mufflers, you twist a knob and they push a felt thing up against the head.
Yes. And his early Gretsch kits had that. His floor tom had it. And,
right. Yeah. That was, Gretsch. It was standard for Gretsch, and also for Ludwig. They came with mufflers, internal mufflers. And he took, he was a firm believer in not using those. And that they kind of, they affected the sound negatively, and that you should do muffling from the top so that you're not pressing up against the head and detuning.
Would that be like using the hydraulic? I guess the hydraulic kind of gets a little bit of a muffle, but would he use like tape?
He would use tape as well. I think he would just, I don't think you see any tape on the hydraulics here, but there are photos where you see him with hydraulic heads, and they have some tape on them. Yeah, like this studio photo. Yeah, so I mean, I think he would fine tune it per session. You know, if the engineer wanted a deader sound, he was happy to change that. He's very experimental, but he's also very adaptable to taking suggestions from artists and engineers. If they want something different, he's happy to try it. He doesn't have an ego about. And I think we talked about this a little bit in the interview. You know, it's like music first for him. He's not going to impose his, you know, ideals on this. But he did impose his ideals a bit on Yamaha and recommended that they not use internal mufflers on any of the drums. And they didn't. I mean, you look at, you know, find me a recording custom kit that has internal mufflers. They don't exist, you know. And that was apparently his suggestion. So
that internal muffling, which was the style at the time before, really went away. And honestly, I wouldn't mind if it came back on some kits. I think it's cool on a snare.
It is.
You know,
it can be cool. Yeah, it can be cool. Yeah. And I think it might be a little bit. I mean, there was a Roy Haynes signature snare that had a internal muffler, and I think that Superphonics maybe still have them. I'm not sure. Actually, no, I don't think they do, because I have a Superphonic, but it's from the 70s. It has an internal muffler. I never use it, but it's there. So far, the Yamaha kits that we've seen have only been in Japan, and when we start to see him using a Yamaha kit in America is around 1980 and 1981. And before I show you some pictures of that, I wanted to talk just very slightly just a little bit about what recording customs are. You know, as I said, they weren't originally called recording customs. They were referred to as the 9000 series. Technically, they were the YD 9000R or the 9000RA. They kind of changed names. They were changing, like, until they settled on recording custom. There were a few different things they called them. They didn't quite settle. If you look at Yamaha catalogs from the late 70s and early 80s, they sort of changed these designations. But I'm referring to what everybody knows as the recording customs. But they were originally called the RA, which I think stood for recording artist. And then there was also the 9000 GA, which stood apparently for gigging artist. And recording artists were made with lacquer shells, and gigging artists were made with covered shells, wraps, because you would, you know, want your lacquer finish in the studio, but you would take your covered finish kit to a gig, so that
your sparkle or whatever.
Yeah, well, they didn't make any sparkles, but they did make wraps. So initially, there was actually in the mid 80s a change to recording customs. The initial generation of recording customs used slightly thinner shells, and although actually there's some misinformation online. I found people who said that the initial shells were thicker, slightly thicker, and by 86 they changed to be slightly thinner, and I've also seen people say the reverse. But what I think is more important is that the early ones up through 1985 had more rounded bearing edges than the later ones. After in 86 they started making a very sharp a 45-degree edge, a bearing edge.
So the earlier ones would have edge. A more thuddier sound, a little bit, or less
warmer, a little warmer, a little rounder, I think. Yeah, and then the later ones would be a little more punchy and possibly a little bit thinner sounding, like a little bit brighter, but with less of kind of like a lower mid-range potentially.
And these were first introduced, you said, in like 78?
It's a little bit unclear. I mean, there are Yamaha catalogs from 76 that refer to the 9000 series, and they initially had lugs. There's actually a picture here of Steve playing a backline kit that was sort of an earlier iteration. So these are different shells. I think they're not birch. Recording customs, all of these drums we're talking about are birch, but there was these earlier generations that had some different woods. I think maybe had some like mahogany mixed in. And they have these different kinds of lugs that look a little reminiscent of Gretsch lugs or Slingerland lugs. these lugs later went on in the mid '80s. They started calling this series the Tour series and the Tour Custom series, which they've since reused that designation for a completely different line of drums. But it gets confusing, and I don't want to just turn this into a Yamaha drum history podcast, because that is a really fascinating subject that somebody who knows more about this than me should give, a full episode on that. But
there is a full Jim Haler did a full Yamaha.
Oh, he did.
Episode,
how have I not seen that?
Which you should check that out. I don't.
Yeah.
Now that I think back to it, Jim is amazing and is truly one of the nicest guys.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But I think Recording Customs, the 9000 series, deserves its own full deep dive.
I agree. Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
Yamaha is one thing. Recording Customs, because I've seen on the forums and the Facebook groups of people.
Yeah.
Someone will put up a Recording Custom from, I don't want to say, I'm not sure the year they stopped making them and started making them again, but it'll be a later one. And they're like, this is $10,000. And people are like, that's insane. You want the earlier ones. The
people are very passionate about this stuff.
They're legendary.
But, And Steve Gadd put these drums on the map. There were a few other artists that were using them at the time. Peter Erskine used them. Al Foster was using them. Charlie Drayton was using them. Cozy Powell was using them. There's all these great drummers, but Steve, I think, was really the iconic sort of face of the Recording
synonymous.
Custom. Yeah, and continued to use them well into the early 90s. But I think it is important to designate, even though I wish I knew. I tried to do as much research as I could, but there was a bit of conflicting information about it. But I think the key thing is that pre-1986 Recording Customs have a rounder bearing edge. And Steve's kits from this era that we're talking about have that. They would have had that bearing edge. So an interesting thing that I started to notice was that when you look at photos of Steve, particularly around New York, but gigs is a little hard because sometimes he's in Europe. He's definitely playing different kits in Europe. Sometimes he's in Japan. He's got different kits in Japan. But I noticed that around New York, photos of him in the studios in New York, and also the videos, the instructional videos he did that I mentioned earlier, up close and in session, I started to notice that there were two distinctly different Recording Custom kits that you see him using in this period. And I wanted to try to figure out what the differences were between them and why he may have been using different kits. And there's basically what I refer to as Recording Custom Kit 1 and Recording Custom Kit 2. And I brought this up with Steve, and he recognized that. And I also brought it up with Artie Smith, and Artie confirmed, yes, there were two kits. And Artie said there was a kit with shallower toms, and there was a kit with deeper toms. And that Steve, he said, you'll find more pictures of Steve using the kit with shallower toms because he preferred that kit. And Artie said it wasn't so much a sound thing, but it was because he could get the toms lower. And because Steve liked to sit really low, he liked to have everything pretty low, and the deeper toms were harder to get, low to the bass drum. So the earliest photo that I could find that definitely had like kind of a known date to it was this photo of Steve on the set of One Trick Pony with Paul Simon, and you see Tony Levin playing bass there. And this is what I refer to as Recording Custom Kit number 1. And of course, all of these are black kits. And an interesting thing that Artie told me about this was that Yamaha became famous a little later for their lacquer finishes, and that they did what they called piano black and piano white lacquer. And what that meant was that the drums were finished the same way that they'd finished their grand pianos, which was
unbelievable pianos.
Oh, incredible. Yeah, some of the best in the
C11s and all that. Yeah, they're incredible. Yeah.
And they have these beautiful finishes, and they go through this very extensive lacquering process where they're given, like 20 coats of lacquer or something like that, and then sealed in this way. Artie said that Steve's drums were not piano lacquered. They were black. They weren't wraps. They weren't covered finishes. They were a painted finish, but they didn't have that seal, and that they were not as shiny and glossy as the piano black lacquer, and that if you looked really close, you could actually see the wood grain in the finish, but you wouldn't see that in any photos. Yeah,
No,
so that was
no.
interesting to learn. But this is the earliest photo. So One Trick Pony came out in 1980. And the stuff was filmed maybe in early 1980, maybe in 1979. But this is the earliest that we see Steve using this kit that would kind of become his number one kit until kind of the late 80s.
Yeah,
And
it's gorgeous.
22-inch bass drum, 14 by 22 bass drum. A distinctive thing you see often with this bass drum is a very small Yamaha logo, which is
Yeah.
a thing that he still uses a lot of the time now.
It's like mini, because I think of almost like Wayne's World when there was the drummer in Wayne's World. It was like a Yamaha kit on one of the white kits.
Oh, yeah.
for Crucial Taunt, and it was this massive Yamaha written across the front of it, which I think was very common.
Yeah, you see that, and actually his other kit has the giant Yamaha, the kit number 2.
Which is cool.
Yeah.
But I like the mini.
So, yeah, I like it too. So this is where you can really clearly see this kit. And he, by this point, has this the big logo. He has a different bass drum head that has his name on it too. So this is what I call kit number 1. This is the same kit you just saw him in 1979 or 1980 using. And
taped bottom heads, obviously.
yeah. So what you see here, 14 by 22 bass drum. He's generally always used just 14-inch depth bass drums. And he talks a little bit about why he doesn't like power size bass drums in our interview. Now, the tom, it's a 10-inch tom, but it's a shallow 10. It's actually 6.5 by 10. And to facilitate this, they use, these lugs are basically snare drum lugs. These are the same types of lugs that you see on this Yamaha snare drum. It's just sort of this interesting sort of fat lug. It doesn't have this, you know, the regular recording custom tom lugs have this thing where they're sort of wide, where the tension rod goes in, and then they taper down to a thin section in the middle before widening again for the bottom head. But this
Very
is just
engineered, very well crafted.
It's a beautiful look. It's a really beautiful look.
Yeah.
Although I guess Premiere were doing something similar to that, dating back to the 50s or something. So, but on this 10, on this shallow 10, different kind of lug. So that's the dead giveaway that he's using kit number 1, is when you see this shallower 10 with the snare drum lugs. The 12 is an 8 by 12. Now, here's where things get really tricky for me. And I've spent literally hours trying to figure out what size these floor toms are. So they're mounted floor toms. And this is where things get interesting with Yamaha, because I don't know if you remember when we were talking about Tony Williams drums, and maybe with Neil's drums too, drum companies often have, if you really know what you're looking for, even if you don't know what the size is, if you can look at the drum, there are often tells. They're sort of giveaways of like what size the drum is. Even if
I remember you
know.
said you could work at a circus and announce the sizes of drums or something like that as you're, instead of guessing weights. If I remember correctly.
that is one of my very useless skills. Although it's coming in handy right now
for these episodes.
So for instance, like with Ludwig, Ludwig fans know that 20-inch bass drums and smaller only have 8 lugs per head, and 22 and larger have 10 lugs per head. This is important when you're talking about Ringo's kits. You see a photo of Ringo and you don't know what size, whether it's the 20-inch bass drum kit or the 22, just look at how many lugs are on the front bass drum. And if it's 10, he's got a 22-inch bass drum. If it's 8. So with Yamaha recording customs, these lugs, because they're one-piece lugs, basically the top and bottom of the lug have to be wide enough to accommodate the tension rods, and then you have this middle section that's thin. So they had different size, different length lugs that they used for different size toms, and the thing that differentiates them is how much space there is between the two fat parts of the tension rod. The lug. They didn't use different sized lugs for every size tom. They would use, so let's take a look at some photos from the Yamaha catalogs of the 80s. So this is a kit with power toms. The size of these toms are 8x8, 10x10, 10x12, 12x14, 14x16. And what you can see here is that the 8 has this size lug with this much space between the two sort of larger parts. Yeah. Now the 10 has a longer lug. You can see this because there's much more space between the two fat parts of the lug. This is a 10x12, so it has the exact same size. So you use the same size. Now, the next tom is a 10x14, and you can see this is an even longer tom, tom lug. This is a kit with a 10x4. So I know these sizes because these are photos from a catalog, and in the catalog they list the sizes. Yeah. So this is a 10x14 and a 12x15. And what's interesting is these use the same size lugs.
Just maybe a longer tension rod?
With a longer tension rod. Exactly. That's the giveaway. And how would I know that this is a 12x15? The way that I would know is that I would see, okay, it's this medium-sized lug with a very long tension rod. Because a longer lug wouldn't fit properly on this. There wouldn't be enough room for you to tension the head. You can see with the 10x14, they're kind of at their limit of how long the tension rod can be because there's very little space between. Man, we're so in the weeds here. If anybody's watching this
far
stuff,
into it though, you're full on drum nerd.
I apologize if this is too much for anybody, but this is the kind of stuff we get into here.
If you're still with us,
we go back to this drum, which is a 9x13. This has that shorter lug. But again, with a very long tension rod. Look at the length of the tension rod here versus here. That's what we're talking about. So when we get back to this, I've been trying to figure out, based on the length of the tension rods and the length of this stuff, I'm trying to figure out what these are. Now, I have another interview with Steve, and I don't even know what the source is because this is something that I Xeroxed back when I was in college. And I know that this is an interview where he's being interviewed by a guy named Les Tompkins, who I believe was a well-known jazz writer. I don't know what magazine this was in. I wish I could give you the source, but it's an interview with Steve. And in this is from the early 80s. And I know that because he talks about his sticks were made by Yamaha. We'll get into the sticks later. But that is something that happened from about 78 until 83. So he talks about the sizes. He says, the setup I have is a 22-inch bass drum, 4 tom-toms, a 10, 12, a 15, and a 16. So these are
10, 12, 14, and 15, a 16.
15, 16.
15, 16.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this looks consistent with what I see here in this black kit from the catalog. I think that first floor tom is a 15x16. If we go by, 12x15. The first floor tom I think is a 12x15. If we look at the length of the tension rods versus the length of the lugs, I think that's what we have here, which means the second tom must be a 16 because it's obviously not going to be smaller, and they didn't make a mounted tom bigger than 16 ever. So I think that if we look at a little later catalog, this is a kit where the last tom-tom is a 14x16. And if I look again at the size of the lugs and the spacing of the tension rods, this looks like the same drum to me.
Yeah.
We also have to look at the distance from lug to lug, along the circumference of the head, and I think that looks similar. So basically, this is, other than actually seeing this kit, and according to Artie Smith, Steve still has this kit. He still has Recording Custom Kit number 1. So unless I ever got an opportunity to actually see Steve's drums and measure them, there's really no other way to try to figure this out other than just being a complete nerd and loser like me and spending hours looking at this and trying to figure out what sizes these toms are.
Well, you could. It's literally not out of the realm of possibility to have Steve or someone Steve knows literally get out a measuring tape at his storage unit and
maybe that'll come to pass someday. But for now, we're going based on what I know about the length of the lugs, the length of the tension rods, and also the little bit that the hints he gives us in these interviews. Now, where it gets even more complicated. Now, you thought this was bad. It gets so much worse when we talk about recording custom kit number 2. Now, this is the kit that we see him using in his first video up close. We see it. So I should also mention that the recording custom kit number 1, I said it was used in One Trick Pony. It's used in Steve Gadd in Session, which is actually a second instructional video. You also see him playing it in, there's a concert video of Paul Simon at the Tower Theater in Philadelphia from 1980. He's using that kit there. There's also session photographs on the back cover of Chick Corea's record, 3 Quartets, and you can see that kit being used there. So those are some places where you can see and hear recording custom kit number 2. Recording custom kit number 1. Okay, recording custom kit number 2 we see in Up Close and a few other places. The Simon and Garfunkel concert in the Park from 1981, he's using this kit. Now this is where it gets complicated. This is actually even more of a deep dive in a way, because we're dealing with some different, even more weird sizes. So this is an 8x10, the first rack tom. And again, we know this. I don't have these photos handy, but if you look at any Yamaha catalog, it's very easy to recognize the size of an 8x10 because of the size of the lugs and the tension rods. Now look at the 12. We know this is a 12 because that's what he always uses as a second tom in this period. Notice this is the exact same size lug, right?
Yep.
Same size
longer
lug, but
rod.
much longer tension rod. So that means that this tom must be deeper than 8 inches deep. It is not an 8x12. I think it's actually a 9x12. So as I said, Yamaha were sending Steve, they were kind of using him as a guinea pig to try out new products. We saw him back in Japan using the kit with all the tom-toms. With like a bunch of extra toms. He was recommending things like, don't use internal muffling. He was kind of like a guy that they would send stuff to and have him try. And I think maybe they were just experimenting with some different sizes. Maybe thinking like, I think by this point, Tama were doing power toms, and maybe Ludwig were too. So maybe they were kind of dipping their toes into the power tom thing and saying like, well, let's try some deeper toms. Let's make a kit with deeper toms and send it to Steve and see if he likes it. And I think maybe that's why we have this. Now, when I talked to Steve, he recognized that these were 2 different kits, but he didn't really have anything to say, as I recall, about, why he had these different sizes. Artie,
to him, it's probably just they're 2 different drum sets. End of story.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And leave it to us nerds to get into this sort of like, the complete, overanalyzation of this stuff. But yeah, as I said, that's what we do.
That's what we're here for.
What I noticed too is that this kit has what appears to me to be deeper floor toms. Again, they're mounted floor toms. I think they're likely either a 14, some combination of 14, 15, and 16. Either 14, 15, 15, 16, or maybe 14, 16. I'm not really sure, but they look deeper to me than the toms that we saw in the recording custom kit number 2.
Yeah, especially the biggest one.
So this is basically these 2 kits together. And, you can see the difference in size of the 12s. I mean, the angles are a little different, but you can see, when you look at the floor toms, you can see that you can see the lug is longer. So look at the distance between the top and bottom of the lug versus this one. That's got to be a deeper drum. And this one is already at least a 14, if not a 15. I think it's a 12x15. So that means this is like, I think this might even be a square size tom. Both of these floor toms, maybe.
Like 14x14 and 16x16 or
maybe,
something,
or 15x15. I'm not really sure, but the point is it's deep. These toms are deep. They're not standard sizes. They're not catalog sizes at all. I think they were experimental sizes that they sent to Steve to try out.
Sure.
So you see this kit again, like, he doesn't use it quite as much, I think. And as Artie said, he thought that he preferred the shallower kit. But you see him use it. There's some photos here. Here's a photo from a recording session in 1982. I think this was a Joe Sample record. And also of interest is he's not using his Superphonic here. He's using a Yamaha wood snare. This, I believe, let's see. That is the SD955RA, which was their sort of high-end wood snare, recording custom snare, birch shell and extended
some tape
snares.
On it. Thick
thick
strap on the snares there.
Secure. But this is that kit with the deeper toms. He still has Evans hydraulic heads on the drums now. In 1982, there's another good photo of it in the studio somewhere here. A lot of these photos, as I said, I found just sort of uncredited on either on Getty Images, or a lot of these came from that Steve Gadd Facebook page. Here's another good photo of him in the studio playing that kit with that same wooden snare drum. Cymbals up pretty high.
Less him, I'm sure he still did it, but coming in, sitting on a kit, playing someone else's drum, another studio drum set, and then leaving. It seems like he's playing more of his own drums at this.
He talks about this in the interview, that there was a point where he started doing more what we would call now like album projects, or more like, for a long time in the 70s, sessions tended to be, or as he says, dates. He would go in and be booked for 3 hours to record a couple of tunes, and then he'd go to another studio and record for 3 hours and record a jingle, and then he'd go to another studio and record another couple of songs for somebody's record. But then there was a point where he mentioned Paul Simon. I think this was probably the case with like the Ricky Lee Jones records or the Carly Simon records, where he would be booked. They would basically block out a studio 24 hours for like 2 weeks and just sit, and like everybody would get there and record an album and kind of develop it together over a period of time. And in those cases, they would book him for the full 2 weeks, and he would be able to just bring his own drums in, and they'd spend time working on the sound, and they would, develop songs over a period of time together, rather than doing it in that sort of old school recording session, like, we have 3 hours to make 2 tunes kind of way.
Album. That's
cool. So you do see that more in this period. But I think also because he had these kits that, Yamaha were supporting him, they were giving him these kits, and they maybe, I don't think that they were paying to have his drums shipped anywhere, but I think maybe he believed in the company and wanted to use their drums and was more into using his own drums at that point. I'm not sure. But you see, as I said, the Pearl kit popped up at certain sessions. I think like a Chick Corea recording session or a Ricky Lee Jones recording session, those are things that to him were more meaningful maybe than just some random jingle session or something, or a random,
where he doesn't care.
Where he doesn't care as much, or it doesn't seem as critical that he has his own exact stuff, but I think he was maybe getting called to do more things like that too, where he would want to have his own drums and his own sound. So it could be, it could be that. So you see both of these kits. I have some good screenshots of the drums and the, this is all from the Steve Gadd up close video. I have these dated as 1982. I think the video came out in 83. I don't know if it was filmed in 82 or 83. An interesting thing to point out is that around this period, you start to see him using a fiber skin snare drum head on the top of the Superphonic snare. And you also see that during this period, you noticed that picture earlier where he's got a bunch of tape on the snare. But this is also the period where you start to commonly see him using a ring on the snare. You can see it a little bit here.
Like a studio ring kind of muffler.
So what the guys used to do is they would take a drum head, a big drum head, like a 16 or an 18, and they'd actually cut the hoop out and then sort of like cut a size, like a ring that would fit in just inside the hoop of the snare. And they, do different sizes, different thicknesses for more muffling. And,
I mean, that's what big fat snare drum, I've heard them say, like that's what,
It is, but they fine tuned it and put a kind of a gasket on it for weight, so it became a thing. But it was a tradition for generations.
I used to use those when I first started playing gigs. I had a ring, that you could get. I think there was a brand called Zero Ring.
Yes.
And you could get those, and Yamaha snares, I think still some of them might come. I think I got an aluminum snare from them that actually had a ring. It came with one.
Oh, that's cool.
I know I have a couple old ones too, but it's still a really great way to muffle a snare, because you get a very even muffling, and you get it like right at the edge when there tends to be more overtones.
Sure. Ritchie Ring is something
Ritchie
I think Bonham
Ring was,
used.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That was a brand. Yeah.
Yep.
Here's another still from the up close video. Again, anybody who hasn't seen this video, it's a must. It's so great. Both of his instructional videos from this period are so good. He plays so well. You can see the shallow 14x22 bass drum here. We've been through recording custom kit number 1 and number 2. There were also some. You see photos of him, here and there at clinics using different kits. I think at this point, by the early 80s, Steve was he was a bona fide star. He was a drum star. He was probably, other than Buddy Rich, and maybe Ringo, probably the most famous drummer, or at least one of the most famous drummers. Certainly among drummers, all drummers knew who he was at this point. He was all over Modern Drummer magazine, and he's in Downbeat, and just getting a lot of visibility. And he starts doing clinics for Zildjian and Yamaha, and I think that he was of such value to Yamaha that they were happy to loan him kits wherever he needed. And other than the 2 kits that lived in, Artie Smith told me he had a facility in the Union Square neighborhood of New York City, where he kept all of these different artists' kits, and he had Steve's 2 kits were there. He did say that Steve would show up with his cymbals himself, like he would bring his own cymbals from home. And that he would carry those himself, but the drums and hardware would come from Artie. There was probably also, certainly there was a kit, maybe multiple kits in Japan. Whenever he was going to Japan, which I think Steve was probably playing in Japan a couple times a year, every year at least. I mean, he still does.
Yeah.
And he's very, very popular there. So Yamaha in Japan would always supply him with whatever he needs, exactly to his spec. He probably had a kit. I know there's a kit that he keeps at, I believe it's Drum Paradise in Nashville, still to this day. Now I know that Yamaha's American distribution, or their American sort of Yamaha drum facility is in the Los Angeles area, and they have one of his kits there. I'm sure he's always had a kit in LA since he's been with Yamaha. Maybe there's others. There might be 1 or 2 in Europe. But basically, at this point, you almost always see him playing a Yamaha black recording custom kit. Occasionally, there's a couple videos of him in Europe where he's playing like a white recording custum kit on one concert.
But it's always Yamaha.
It's always Yamaha. I don't think. I mean, you occasionally, again, like there's some photos. He recently did a record with David Gilmour from Pink Floyd, and there's some photo and video of him where he's actually playing a '60s Ludwig kit in the studio. And this is just a studio kit probably, and it was just something that they got a sound that they liked for the record, and he's happy to play it, so
sure.
You occasionally still see him using something else like that, but 9 times out of 10 it's a black. I mean, in this era, in the 80s, it's a recording custom kit. So I have a few photos, from here's a photo from a clinic in 1984. He doesn't have a beard here. He's playing, this isn't, I don't think.
I would not recognize him.
Yeah, I know.
If I just looked
at
this.
There was a period in around 84 where he shaved his beard. there's actually an amazing video of him, Zildjian Day in New York from 1984, where he plays just one of the most amazing drum solos. And he's clean shaven. It's very strange.
You don't see it very
often.
often.
This is another photo of him without a beard. This is him. I suspect, because this is not Recording Custom Kit 1 or 2, I think this might be in LA somewhere, and he's packing up his cymbals in an Anvil cymbal case, which Steve actually talks about in our interview. He talks about that case.
Yeah.
I think this is typical for him traveling with the cymbals. There's other interesting photos of him. Here's one from a recording session. I believe this was an Italian artist, Pino Daniele, or maybe Daniela, a singer. I believe this session was actually in Italy, and he's got a Recording Custom Kit that actually has coated heads. And I believe this is 1985. He's got his own cymbals. He's got his snare drum. You can see the Anvil cymbal case in the back there. But, so wherever he was, he could get recording customs. Either they were his that he kept somewhere. This is a Eddie Gomez quartet or quintet gig in 1988 in Germany, I believe, and he's playing a recording custom kit. This has some funny head choices, pinstripes on the floor toms. Oh, I should mention, this is important. In 1984, we start to see him using pinstripes. He leaves the Evans hydraulic heads and moves to using Remo pinstripes, which is kind of his head of choice until about the mid-90s on the toms. And the bass drum, too. The Zildjian Day video that I mentioned from New York in 1984, he's got pinstripes on the toms by that point. And also the Steve Gadd in session video, he's got pinstripes. And the sound changes a little bit. It gets a little more open. And I asked Artie about that. He remembered that switch, and he said that it was just kind of the sound of the time. The sound was opening up a little more, and producers were wanting, a little more resonance and maybe a little more bite from the toms, as opposed to the 70s sound, which was that deader, drier
thuddy.
sound. Yeah. I brought this up with Steve. There was a photo of him in a Yamaha catalog from 1985 where he's playing a kit with power toms and a power bass drum. So Yamaha had briefly, I mentioned that they were experimenting with power toms. Very briefly, in a 1985 catalog, offered basically what we call square size toms, which there was a 10 by 10, which they did stick with for a while, a 12 by 12, 13 by 13, 14 by 14, etc. And they also made bass drums that were 18 inches deep. They made an 18 by 22 and an 18 by 24. And what we see is this picture of Steve posing with this kit that has a 10 by 10, a 12 by 12. I don't know exactly what the floor tom sizes are, but they're very long, and an 18 by 22 bass drum and an 8 by 14 deep wood snare drum. I showed this to Steve, and he immediately says, "Oh yeah, I never really played those. I
just posed.
Yeah, posed with it. That was something they were trying out." He did play them. There's a video of him in Japan around that same time period. I think with I forget who the artist is. That you can see a drum solo. If you look through Ruben Van Roon's YouTube channel, where he's got all these different clips of Steve Gadd drum solos, you can see a drum solo clip where he's using these very deep tom-toms. So I think he did experiment with them a little bit, but it wasn't really his thing. But that's just another example of him playing, basically a backline kit. That was it's technically backline, but it's to his specs. This was him in 1986. This is great photos taken by Lisa Wales, who took really amazing photos of all of our favorite drummers at events like PASIC and NAMM and things like that. This is him at PASIC in 1986 playing a really beautiful recording custom kit, and he's playing a Yamaha piccolo snare, which I'd never seen him play before or after. I think it was just a new drum that they were promoting and gave it to him to play. Again, he has his own cymbals.
That's the place to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It was probably a drum that was on display. He famously did the Buddy Rich Memorial Scholarship Concert in 1989 in Los Angeles, where he does the drum battle with Dave Weckl and Vinnie Colaiuta that everybody's seen.
Yep.
He also plays a few tunes with the Buddy Rich Big Band. He's using, this was done in LA, and he's using basically, it's not kit number 1 or kit number 2. It's just, maybe this was his LA kit, or maybe it was a rental, I don't know. But it's, again, to his spec, 10-12. I think it's 15 and 16 on the floor. This is a nice shot. These are also Lisa Wales picks. He's got pretty new pinstripes. He's got his very worn Superphonic. You can see the finish is kind of, the chrome is starting to chip away. So he was, you almost always see him playing these drums. And then the last recording custom kit really to talk about, and again, I don't know for sure if it's a separate kit or if it's one of the, it possibly, I thought possibly this, for a long time, I thought this was kit number 2 with the deeper toms. This is a still from the Paul Simon concert in the Park in 1991. Paul Simon did this big tour for his album Rhythm of the Saints in 1990-91. And I actually saw this tour in Pittsburgh when I was still in high school. My dad took me to see this at the Civic Arena in Pittsburgh. And this was the first time that I ever saw Steve Gadd play live, and it was really amazing. And Michael Brecker was in the band. He was sort of the guest soloist, and he was playing saxophone solos on a lot of stuff. And this is sort of like the last hurrah for Steve before he switched to Maple Customs. This tour in 91, he's using this, a black recording custom kit. And what I see here again is a similar thing where it looks like a 12 that's a little deeper because of the length of the tension rods. But it's possible maybe this is a 7x10 or something. I'm not really sure what's going on here, but I don't think this is the same kit as recording custom kit number 2 that I mentioned before. And I think the reason is because maybe I'm wrong. I thought maybe the badges look different on the toms, but they actually do look sort of the same. I'm not really sure.
Yeah.
This might be a whole different kit. He might have ordered a whole new kit just for that tour.
I mean, they all, if they're the same size, they look, it's hard to tell with black drums like that.
Exactly.
And there's not a, old piece of hardware on the bass drum that you can identify or
right, exactly, yeah. But one thing that is different about this kit is he added, just for this tour, a really big 18-inch floor tom, an actual floor tom on legs that he set up on his left. And he used this a fair amount on that tour, and you can see this video now. It's finally available. You can stream it, I think, on Amazon. The Paul Simon concert in the Park. It's really, really fantastic.
I'll have to watch that
concert.
Yeah,
it's really, really good. Yeah, I taped this. In fact, I went to see this concert with my dad in Pittsburgh, and then shortly after, it was like August of 91. This concert in Central Park was actually live broadcast on HBO. And I remember knowing about it and knowing Steve was going to be there because I'd seen them and knew he was in the band, and I actually taped it on our VCR at home. So I taped it and then watched it just over and over and over and over again, endlessly. Especially Steve has a couple little drum solos, and I just watched those just endlessly. Awesome. Yeah, so I remember this very well.
Of taping things on TV, and the only way you could see it more than once.
Yeah, and I would pause it and play things in slow motion, and it was really fun. So still with the Superphonic 10-12, you can really see here, if you look at the size difference between the head of the snare and the head of the first floor tom, I'm pretty sure this is another example of 15 and 16 are his 2 floor tom sizes. And then he's got
14 snare. It's definitely bigger.
It's bigger, right? And then the big floor tom on the left, he's got pinstripes all around, 14x22 bass drum. So this is sort of, at this point, after this, you mostly see him using Maple Customs. So that kind of closes out the first chapter of his recording custom and his, Yamaha era. Just before we close up, I had mentioned before that when you asked me back with the Gretsch kit what kind of pedal he was using, all through this recording custom period, he's using a as I mentioned, a Gretsch floating action. And this is actually a still I took from Steve Gadd in session. You can see when his foot lifts up, you can see the Gretsch floating action logo very clearly. You can also see in this still how far up he has the bass drum beater. And this is also interesting.
Wow.
That, believe it or not, that's a Yamaha bass drum beater. That's not the beater that would have come on that pedal. That's actually a Yamaha beater, which has a black shaft. There's a very distinctive look that Yamaha had for their beaters in this era. And I remember because I had a Yamaha pedal that had that exact beater for a long time. But you can see he's
very
got like
extended.
It's very extended. Yeah, he's getting a lot of leverage from the pedal. And then there's also some footage that I have a still where you can very clearly see the Yamaha beater with the black shaft, and also the black, where the beater sort of like clamps on or screws onto to the shaft is also black. You can see that instead of the leather strap, he's actually got a nylon strap by this point, which was a very common hack for people to modify their floating action pedals with a nylon strap instead of the originals. Came with leather straps that pretty quickly would stretch or break. Yeah. Elvin Jones was famous for breaking his constantly. He used to bring like 3 bass drum pedals to every gig because he broke so many of them. Steve has a nylon strap on this, and you can see that there's a few different videos where you can sort of see behind the. Here's another one. This is a little hard to see, but you can see the pedal. You can also see a stick bag that says Yamaha drums on it, which is pretty cool. And you can also see how high up that beater is.
Amazing.
So yeah,
good detail.
So we can end this episode on the floating action pedal.
Yeah, and I think it's as Paul has said, it's probably wise as it's now 11 o'clock for our sake. We will then do a part 2 where we pick up, I guess, basically in the early 90s. Yeah. And then carry it on through to today. And then talk about cymbals and sticks and heads and more details in part 2.
Yeah. And just as a little teaser, I've got some important props to show you, including the original Yamaha Steve Gadd drumsticks that we can talk about in the next episode.
Teaser, yeah. So there'll be sticks, there'll be heads, there'll be much more floor tom measuring in extreme detail.
Luckily, I think we're done with measuring floor toms because it gets pretty. By the time we get to Maple Customs, it's all standard catalog sizes. Thank God.
Yeah. So we'll pick it up on the Maple Customs. But I think that truly, though, I'm saying that as a joke, but that's why people I think like this. Of like, I enjoy the like CSI style. Like looking at this, and the same thing happens on every episode where we talk about Lars's gear with Chris Ruscio or anything. It's like, it's people want to know the nerd, extreme details, and I think it's great.
I love the Lars episodes, and I'm not like a Lars. I like Lars. I like Metallica, but I'm not like a super fan or anything. And I didn't know much of anything about those kits. I learned so much watching those.
Those were great.
I love the detail. I just live for that stuff. It's so fascinating for me. So hopefully other people are enjoying this stuff too.
For sure. And what's neat is Chris actually went on and did a bunch of YouTube stuff, and his YouTube channel has gotten a lot bigger, and he's gotten into YouTube after doing those episodes, which is great, which is totally aside from this. But so Paul and I will be back in the next episode, which will be out after this, obviously. If you're watching it live, it'll be probably 2 weeks after this one comes out, depending on when we get it recorded. But knowing my current release schedule, who knows? But it'll be out at some point. And,
it gives people plenty of time to measure their floor tom lugs.
The length of their tension rods and things. No, I think it's super cool. Yeah. So, Paul, you want to tell people where they can find you before we wrap up on this one?
My website is paulwellsdrums.com, and my Instagram handle is paulwellsdrums, or at paulwellsdrums. You can find me on YouTube. I have not much on YouTube, but Instagram's kind of the only place that I'm active. So
Yeah, and if you're around New York, I mean, you gig all over the world, but
yeah, I mean, well, I think actually by the time you post this, I'll have already been and gone to London. But I'm going to London next week to play at Ronnie Scott's with Curtis Stigers. Let's see, we're there from September 6th until September 11th. So.
Nice.
In case this gets posted before then, and anybody's watching the second it gets posted, if you happen to be in London, come see us at Ronnie Scott's. If you miss it, we're at Ronnie Scott's again in I think the first week of February.
Very cool.
And then I'm also in Germany in end of October, beginning of November. So for your European fans, check out Curtis Stigers' calendar. Or check out my website's calendar, because sometimes Curtis does stuff with other bands. And then I'm at Birdland every Monday and Tuesday with Vince Giordano when I'm in New York.
Nice. Okay, that's something cool, because there's a lot of people who listen in New York, so that's a cool. Go up to Paul after the show or before the show. Don't start screaming, I saw it, I love drum history, I love your episodes during the show. That might get some
floor tom tension rod length.
They'll be like, they'll put your circus skills to the test and bring some drums for you to measure at a distance.
I need to figure out a way to make a living off of my knowledge of how many lugs are on the front head of a Ludwig 20-inch bass drum.
Yeah.
If only those skills were as valuable as like brain surgery, I think I'd be,
Yeah, that's a close second.
I could retire.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you to everyone for watching this and for sticking with the show through all these years. And Paul, thank you for doing so much research and putting the effort in and coming back in for episode 8 or 9 you've joined me with.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me on, and thanks for everybody for putting up with all of this extreme nerdery. I'm glad that some people enjoy it.
Yeah, people love it.
Yeah,
all right. Well, I will see you on part 2 then.
All right. See you soon.